Alright guys, what's going on? It's Mr. Smith, and about 10:15. You guys had left about almost an hour ago. But I want to go ahead and start going over chapter 14 a little bit with you. And as you see on your screen here, this is the summarization sheet. And you might be wondering why we're not spending more time talking about the Civil War, but understand the AP exam does not discuss much when it comes to the wars. They'll ask you about a particular battle, but they're not like tough questions. It's more about like which battle was a turning point, or which battle saw this commander die, or something very specific that generally everybody knows. So really when we talk about the Civil War, we're really trying to create a conclusion based on everything that's happened up to this point in American history, and then also make a foreshadowing for what maybe will happen after it. All right. Some of this is really easy and simplistic to fill in, so let's go ahead. The war begins sort of with Lincoln's election. Remember, Lincoln is a Republican. He was a representative of the Republican Party, and probably just because not many people knew him. All right, that set off a string of states to secede from the Union. Many people feared that he was anti-slavery, which he really didn't give a stance one way or another. But South Carolina is going to be the first state to go ahead and secede from the Union. They're going then to lead 6 more states by the time February comes around, and together those 7 states are going to form what we call the Confederate States of America. Okay. And what they began doing is they began going through the South and seizing federal property throughout the South. Now understand that once Lincoln was elected and South Carolina began talking about secession, the government already started withdrawing a number of the federal troops out of the South. The only one that still had significant troops was Fort Sumter, which will be attacked by the Confederate forces from Charleston, South Carolina, in April of '61. By May, there's a total of, and this numbers kind of varies, but there's a total of 10 to 11 Confederate states and 4 Union slave states, or what we might call border states. All right. Now, when we talk about the advantages of the two sides, I'm just going to kind of go through here and highlight these. But the Union obviously has more people. The Union is going to have 22 million compared to the South's 5.5 white population. Also, the Union is getting, during this time period, about 800,000 immigrants coming from Germany, Ireland, Sweden, basically the northwestern portion of Europe. All right. Also, in terms of population, you have another 180,000 free blacks living in the north. So their population is much higher. So that means they have much more people to draw from in terms of fighting this war. Okay. Industrial capacity, I think this is an easy one. The Union has much more industrial capacity. In fact, I remember reading a statistic that said that the state of New York alone in 1 year produced more firearms than the entire South did during the Civil War. All right, and that's going to have a big impact when it comes to supplying the troops, supplying the weapons, and just being able to carry out the war. Now, the issue with that later on is going to come, and who's going to work in those factories to produce that stuff when you need men to fight. All right. In terms of slaves, obviously the Confederacy has many more slaves, but this could be a good thing or a bad thing, because when you have slaves, yes, that means you have people working in your farms, producing the crops to feed the troops, but who's at home to watch over the slaves? That creates fear among the women who are left at home. Then there's some discrepancy over, do we let the planters fight the war, or do we let the poor white Yemen farmers fight the war? All right, so that has some impacts as well. When we talk about military strategy, the South has a better military strategy. And I always talk to kids about the game King of the Hill, right? When you're on top of the hill, you can see everything that's happening. You know where your attack is coming from. Well, it's very similar to the Civil War. The South doesn't have to leave their portion of the country and they would win a war. The North has to prove that the South has left, and they have to sort of go into the South and pull them back in into the Union. So what happens a lot of times in terms of this is the South gets to fight a defensive war. Also, it's their territory, so they know all the nooks and crannies of the South. They know where they can fight. Throughout the war, the North is going to get mixed up in terms of where to fight battles, where's the best place to hide out, things like that. So there's going to be some problems in terms of that. Going back to the geography of the South and fighting it in military strategy, the South not only gets to fight a defensive war, but the North is so outdated in terms of its topography or the maps of the land that they don't know where the railroads are, where the roads are, where the plantations are. Their maps go as far back as 1812. All right, so literally there's been about 40 to 50 years in between where there's no updated map. So that's going to hurt the North. Now, the North strategy is a smart strategy. It's called the Anaconda Plan, all right, where they're going to create a blockade around the coastline all the way around Florida, all the way up the Mississippi, and then they're going to try to squeeze the South in, all right, and just like an anaconda snake, how it constricts and kills its prey by strangling it. That's what the North is going to try to do. But that's a long defense line. That's a long border to create a blockade on. That's a lot of territory that the North doesn't really know that they're going to have to try to consolidate and try to manage and things like that. So we give that advantage to the South. All right, obviously railroad mileage goes to the North. In fact, in the North, there's over 70% of all the railroad mileage in the country is in the North. Okay, the South has less than a couple thousand, whereas the North has many more miles. So that's very advantageous for troop delivery, equipment delivery, transfer of troops to and from battles, things like that. Okay, money. Obviously, the North has the most money. They're the center of the banking. That's where the wealthiest people in America live. Even though cotton obviously is the largest exporter in the country, most of the North contains more millionaires. There's more connections to the rich in Europe, things like that. Okay. Now the South does have the diplomatic leverage, all right, and why? Cotton, all right, because cotton is over 50% of makes up over 50% of America's exports. They're going to use this King Cotton diplomacy. That's what it's called, King Cotton diplomacy, to try to get Great Britain and France to recognize the South as an independent nation. And they almost do. And a part of that diplomacy and the attempts to get them to recognize the South as an independent nation are going to impact their success and failure rate. For example, the whole purpose of the South invading the North and going through Antietam and Gettysburg was because they needed to prove to those countries that they could defeat the North. So they're going to use this cotton, but as we'll talk about later on, it proves ineffective because England and France are going to find better cotton, cheaper cotton elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world at this point. All right. Otherwise, the Confederacy does have that advantage. Okay. When we talk about motivation and purpose. Again, Confederacy, they're the ones who feel like they've been attacked by the North. Just as we did with that activity, their whole feelings are that the North has come down on them. And so it's easier to create motivation amongst the South by saying, look at the North. They're trying to take away our livelihood. They're trying to change the way we live. They're trying to make the blacks equal and make the slaves one of us. And, so there's this defense motivation. There's also that motivation of independence, being able to dictate your own economy and, what they say is claim more money for the cotton that they produce. And so motivation and purpose-wise, the South definitely has the advantage. In the North, it's much, much more difficult to pull people into this war because Lincoln approaches this war as the sole purpose of maintaining the Union. Well, even in America at this time period, everybody's not really there's not a big nationalistic feeling. All right, everybody's kind of either New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians or Ohioans or whatever. All right, and so a lot of people don't see that motivation of protecting the Union. They don't see what they might get out of it if the South leaves, and so not a lot of people are going to be motivated to take part in this war. And so really the motivation's not going to change until the Emancipation Proclamation, until they start drawing on that moral issue of slavery. Okay, and last but not least, again, support of the population is going to come from the South. The North is much more industrialized, so people are going to be more focused to work. All right, and I always think about it, what type of kids come out of the South? Country kids, right? We did that activity the other day looking at generals and which the North or South were likely to send more people to West Point. Well, it's the South. Because, as a kid, from a wealthy family, what are you going to do? You might go around playing in the woods and hunting and stuff like that. The South is going to have much better generals, much better soldiers. All right, they're just not going to have enough of them. And so what happens is the North is going to take a long period of time to train their soldiers, to create a military that's going to prove equal to the South. The Northern generals are ineffective. They're very hesitant, whereas the Southern generals, they know how to attack. They have much more experience. They know the wilderness and things like that. Okay. Now, I'm going to break this whole thing up into two here, but I want to stop right about here. When we talk about actual war, and there's always a question about, was there ever a formal declaration of war? And the answer is no, there is not. All right, and the reason why is Lincoln doesn't really feel that a declaration is needed. I guess that's a bit. If they declare war, then they recognize the South as an independent nation. All right, and so for Lincoln and the Republicans in the North, they can't recognize the war because their whole point is that the South is they're treasonous. They've left the Union, and that the whole purpose of fighting is to maintain the Union. All right. Oh. All right, and we'll stop here, and I'll come back and we'll do a little bit more in a little bit.